I think next week I'll get the earpiece where I can walk around and not be stuck right here. We had that in the other classroom, and that worked out really fine. So next week we'll get the. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Nah, you have to do all that stuff. I can do it this week. But okay, you can put it on me. As you study chapter 1 and chapter 2, you can see obviously that he's returning. But some things before that I want to say. All right.
Put it a little bit higher.
A little bit higher. How's that? Anybody hear me? It's on. Do we need to turn it up? Is it working? Lee, can you hear me? It's important. See? All right, he says he can hear me. But anyway, the idea of the returning, one of the things I want to stress again, in their returning, we're talking years later. We talked about when they went off into captivity, Babylonian captivity with Nebuchadnezzar. That's back in the year about 608 or 607, depending on maybe a year, give or take, depending on who's counting the history. But here we are with Nehemiah returning, and historically he's returning somewhere around 445. 445. Again, give or take a few years. But how many years have gone by since they first went into captivity? How many? We have all the 600s, right? I mean, all the 500s. So really about, 150 years, give or take? Who's left? Who's still living that originally went off into captivity? Nobody. They all died. Nobody lived 150 years. Although I did have, I was saying to Ray today, a fellow I knew in Maine, he kept a book of old people that died ages from around the world. And he had one of a fellow that died in Brazil that lived to be, you ready for it, 154. Well, it doesn't matter, but his thing was that you could live a long time. He wasn't a Christian, never did obey the gospel, but I said, you're still going to die. No matter how long you live, we need to be ready for that. Anyway, his wife was a Christian, but he wasn't. But nobody's left. They all have died. But what were they doing while they were in captivity? They still had the law. They still tried to practice as well as they could. When we were in the other class in the small classroom, that's where the synagogue things developed. That's where it was just a different thing. They no longer had any opportunity of doing what? They couldn't go to the temple. They couldn't offer sacrifices like they had in the past. But they were doing, if I can say this, what they could. They had all of that. They still had the teaching. They still had the priests. And like I said, when the first group went back, when Zerubbabel went back, what did he take with him? What did he take with him back? All the stuff. They had all the bowls and the plates and the gold and the silver and the ornaments. They had all that stuff, and it went back. Well, time is interesting. I made a little list for myself. We talk about time with God. From Peter's example, that 1 year is like a what? I mean, 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. I mean, it's just nothing. For who? For God. And think about it on the other end. When I think about myself, I kind of counted up the days. How many days have I lived? Can you believe it? Oh, I don't have to look at that. 28,835 days. That's how many days I've lived. But does God think I'm old? If a day is like 1,000 years, how old could I be in God's sight? Well, I put that down here as 28,835. Well, that's a long time in God's sight. I'm an old kind of guy. And then how about the idea that in the Psalms it says 1,000 years with God is like the passing of a watch in the night. Well, that would be either 3 hours or 4 hours, depending on the period. It changed somewhere along there with the armies and so on. But if it was 3 hours of passing in the night was like 1,000 years, that means each day was like 6,000 years. Interesting, isn't it? And if they were 4, that would be 8,000 for 3. If they were 4 in the night, that'd be 6,000 years. What I want you to see is when we think about this, they were in captivity for so long. Well, in God's sight, how long were they in captivity? Just a short time. But when we think about our lives day after day, week after week, year after year, well, it seems like a long time. But we're talking about God's time. So here they were in captivity day after day. And what were they doing? Again, let me suggest, for the most part, they were being faithful to God as best they could. So when Zerubbabel went back, 50,000 went back with him. And those years later, when Ezra went back, really about 80, 90 years later, another 40,000 went back. And when Zerubbabel went back, when Nehemiah went back, 42,000 went back with him. But here's the interesting thing. There were still others that never came back. They were still there. Maybe that's why when J.C. Choate, anybody know the missionary J.C. Choate or heard of that missionary J.C. Choate, long old-time fella? He spoke with a man in 1967. He was working with the Highway 128 Church of Christ outside of Boston. And he met this man in Iran. And they got to talking about things. Of course, he's always trying to do mission work, trying to convert others. And before he knew it, the man began to talk about the church. He said, "Oh, I'm a member of the Church of Christ. I'm a member of the Church of Christ. There's a large group here in Iran extending into southern Russia. It's a large group." And when they got to talking about it, they realized about 750,000 people. One of the congregations, 15,000 members in the congregation. Interesting. Well, they talked a while, and he said he didn't ask for any money, didn't ask for anything, didn't ask, just two Christians talking. He said, "I can't think why he would tell that story if it wasn't true." But here's the thing I want to say. When Christ was born, they were the wise men, those that saw the star and came to Jerusalem. They came from this area. They came on the other side of the river. That's the Euphrates River. And they saw the star and they came. How would they even know about following the star? How would they even know anything about one was to be born? Well, I would have to think that maybe they had in their mind those things that Daniel had written. And what did Daniel write about the fulfillment of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar? What did he say about that? That you're the gold, and then there'll be the silver and the bronze. And well, it talked about his kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom that was to come, that we're here involved now with Nehemiah. But what came later? The Grecian kingdom. Who was the big leader in the Grecian kingdom? You guys that are the historians. Who was the big guy that established the Grecian kingdom? And you're thinking, Dick, everybody knows that. I'm not going to tell you. Who was that? How about Alexander the Great? He was the one that finally defeated the Persians and took over the empire, took over the world, and ruled. And who came after the Greeks? Well, that was the Romans. And we see them really coming to power in about 146, 147. But see, that was all prophesied by Daniel. But the other thing that was prophesied, that during the time of these kings, there would be a kingdom be established that will not be left to another. And it talked about the kingdom that Christ would establish. And that's where we are, and it's still here. It's still here. Now, the thing that happened with the establishment of the church and the kingdom that Christ established, each and every individual became responsible for themselves. We usually think about it that way. But as we'll see, as we look at these lessons, it also started during the time of Ezekiel. And you read that in chapter 18. Sometimes when you're having a personal study, people will talk about original sin. You ever had that kind of talk with somebody? You know, about the Adam and Eve in the garden and the sin, and was just carried down and passed down. Well, Ezekiel dealt with that, and that was during the time of the captivity when these things were written. And as you read in Ezekiel chapter 18, it says very clearly that the Father will not bear the iniquity of the Son, nor will the Son bear the iniquity of the Father. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon the righteous, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon the wicked. The soul that sins will die. Well, that's where we're at today. Everybody individually responsible. But what we're going to find as we develop through Nehemiah, we have a complete reading of the law. We'll see that in a couple weeks. A complete reading of the law, and the people stood and they listened and they heard it. And they commanded or they dedicated themselves to be followers, to be keepers of the law. Now, here's the thing, and we'll see what they're saying in a couple weeks. Who can keep the law? Shake your head this way. Nobody. I mean, the old law, 624 do's and don'ts. What did you do when you didn't do it? Well, the law. We can't keep the law. And if you can't keep the law, when you fail in one point, what is that called? Sin. And then they have places in the Scripture in the Old Testament where it shows, verse after verse after verse after verse, that when you commit this sin, this is the offering that you make. And when you commit this sin, this is the offering that you make. And when you commit this sin, this is the offering that you make. And just verse after verse after verse after verse. And I suppose if I were your neighbor under the Old Testament, living under the law, what would you see me doing from time to time? Taking my sacrifice to the temple, making my offering for my own forgiveness. Well, those days are gone. So here we are, moving ahead all those years. And again, we'll see those things from Nehemiah, but here we are, and we're Christians. And as Christians, how many of us sin? Oh, who said that? Everybody sins. Everybody sins. You believe in Jesus? Why are you sinning? Well, we sin. And it's so clear from 1 John, about everybody says, well, we walk in the light as he is in the light. We have fellowship one with another. And what happens? The blood of his Son cleanses us from all sin. Notice the next verse. If we say we have no sin, we make him a liar. What does God say we do as Christians? We sin. I like the next verse. But if you're faithful and just and confess your sin, he's righteous and faithful to forgive your sin. Who says you sin? God does. Who says you can be forgiven? God does. Who's responsible for your forgiveness? You are. So here's Nehemiah bringing the people back. Now, of course, he does the building of the wall and sealing that off, and we're going to talk about that. But really, it all had to do with setting the people apart, with allowing the people to no longer be associated with who? Who were they no longer being associated with? The ungodly. They were separated from them. When we think about who came back with Nehemiah? Who came back with Ezra? Who came back with Zerubbabel? What tribes were they? Benjamin and Judah. The 10 tribes of the north are gone. So here they are coming back, and they're going to be separate. They're no longer going to be associated together. They're no longer going to be subjected to those things. But here they are, all the laws to keep. And when they said that we will keep it, they stood before the people. They stood before one another, and I've lost my page. Isn't that terrible? Yeah, I may have to use your notes. Aha. You would think I could find my very first page of my lesson. All right, I've got it. So there they are with 624 laws, but how about us as Christians? I'm going to just say that once. How about 1,025? Can you imagine in the New Testament? Things we should do, things we shouldn't do. Now it's stated, some things more in one place and, stated more times than once. But we're not left with somehow trying to figure out what we should be doing or what we shouldn't be doing. The same thing we're going to see as we look at Nehemiah and they read the law. So as we look at this question about their returning, we're seeing here that he has returned. He has returned. And how did they come to return? Look at the very first thing. What did Nehemiah ask his brother, Haman? What did he ask him? What is the condition? Is that right? How are things in Jerusalem? And what did he find out? What was the answer? What was he asking? Well, how are the people? How long has he been away from them? How long have they been back? Well, if we look at the time, he's talking about the people that went back. The people went back in 458 BC. They're the ones that went back with Ezra. They're the ones that went back with Zerubbabel. So there are people there. So how are they doing? How's the wall? What's happening? How about question number 2? What was the condition? Who has some comments there about the condition of the Jews in Jerusalem? They're what? Great distress. Who was causing all the distress? Who was causing all the problem for those that were living in Jerusalem at the time? Who was doing that? For the most part, it was the people of the land, those that were already living there. Before, when the Jews were active and the city was built and the city was controlled, they were there, and then they were the outside people. And really, they couldn't accept that idea. And again, as they begin, they just didn't want to see them succeed. You suppose there are any people today that know you as a Christian and would not like to see you succeed? You suppose there are friends and family and co-workers and neighbors that here you are living the Christian life, and as you live the Christian life faithfully, and you're putting into practice those things that God would have you to do and the way they would have you to live, how does that reflect on those that are not? Yeah, lost. You don't have to say, you're lost. You know you're lost. But they know if they're living the way you are. They know if they're worshiping the way you are. They know if they're accepting of biblical teachings the way that you are, just like the people of Nehemiah's day. They knew. So I have some things down here. They were in great distress. They're the reproach of the land or the people. It says about the wall being broken down. The gates were burned. Well, how long have they been there? Again, 90 years, 80 years, and it was still burned and broken? And he's hearing it, And if you had that concern for the people, what if you heard that, I don't know, wake up one morning and the church building here had burned to the ground? Would you be sad about that? Would you have to see it firsthand for there to be sadness in your heart? No, just like Nehemiah, he'd never seen it, he's just hearing it. Well, in question number 3, it says, why was Nehemiah afraid when the king Artaxerxes noticed his countenance? What did he notice about his countenance, Steve? Sadness. How'd you word it, Deanna? Sadness. Can people see the way that we live, the way that we look? Oh. People can tell when we're down. People can tell when we're sad. Now, if you go around sad all the time, they might be surprised when you're happy. But here's the king's cupbearer that's with him every day. And he's the one that cares for the king, knows about his food, knows about his drink. And, of course, if you look up the information about being a cupbearer, there was always a possibility somebody might poison the king. And, he had to taste food and taste the drink, and just depending on the situation. It doesn't say he did that but that's why he was there. He was a close friend of the king. Now, when you think about Nebuchadnezzar, one of the first of the captivities, who became his close ally religiously? You think, oh, that's Daniel. He told Daniel told the dream, and he was elevated in the country. He became a statesman. Well, here's Nehemiah with the king every day. What's the matter with your having this countenance, this sadness? Well, what do you see there as it says in verse 2? It says he was afraid. Why do you think he was afraid? The king asked about his sadness. In verse 2 says, I was afraid. Well, because he didn't want to say it. He didn't want to upset the king, I would suppose. But what happened in the end? What finally happened? Verse 4. Well, he asked questions. What was Nehemiah's response? He prayed about it. Do we find ourselves doing that? When we have problems and difficulties, or the problems and difficulties of somebody else even, we pray about it. We ask God's direction and his help. I know one lady that when she's praying, she has three marbles of different colors. Has them in a little bag. If I should do this thing, let me pull out the red marble. If I shouldn't do this thing, let me pull out the blue marble. And if I shouldn't be concerned at all, let me pull out the white marble. Well, I'm not saying that you should pray that way, but what do you do in your prayer? What do you ask God? How do you pray in such a way that he knows that you're asking him something, that you're wanting him to do something? Isn't that what we want to do? I mean, when we're praying for those that are having medical problems, do you think we're praying to inform God? We're really praying to God to do what? Yeah, help him, make things better. And of course, just like Christ, as he prayed, let your will be done, but we have an idea, do we not? Aren't we having an idea when we're praying of what we want God to do? And do we always get the answer that we want? Shake your head this way. No, we don't get the answer always that we want. Even Christ, when he prayed not to die, you read it there in the Hebrew letter, where it says in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplication with loud crying and tears to the one that was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. I mean, you think about him in the garden, he went and prayed and came back, and not my will be done, but thy will be done. But I think when you read it in the Hebrew letter, it's very clear. What's he asking for? Not to die. Did he die? Whose plan was that? That was God's plan. That was God's plan. And in the end, he died. And of course, you can see it from other places before the foundation of the world. It talks about being the plan. So when we're praying, let me encourage you to pray very specifically. Ask God what you will. So anyway, that's what Nehemiah did. He asked. And when he came back to the king, what did he say? What did he say to what did he ask the king? There in question number 4. Send me to where? Send me to Judah. Send me to the city of my fathers, of their tombs, that I may rebuild it. And what was the king's question? How long? But in the end, he went. He went. And he stayed, it says, a short while. Later, he stayed 12 years. That's estimated. And why was he staying 12 years? Well, he became the governor. He was the one that took care of and made proper reports to the king about those things, so that I may rebuild it. And really, what did he end up rebuilding? Well, the walls. But as you read the text, we're talking about houses were rebuilt and communities reestablished, and they went to their own city and established places. I mean, it's just, yes, they built the wall, but the people were reestablished. And we'll see where they came and they made those declarations. But for now, I want to rebuild the wall. I want to do the rebuilding. So we finally come down to number C. He arrived in Jerusalem. And who was with him? I have verse 9. What do you see in 2:9? How many? Okay, good. They had the officers, the army, and horsemen. He came with protection. Now, I don't know if you've thought about how that would be, that he needed protection or thought he should have protection. But what kind of reports had they been receiving back in the king's palace? What kind of reports did Cyrus receive? What kind of reports did Darius receive? What kind of reports had Artaxerxes received? They got letters from the land, from the people about this uncontrollable group of people and how they were wicked and the things that they would do, and they didn't want them to rebuild. And isn't it interesting, we can't talk about all of that, but isn't it interesting as the dissenters, if I can use that word, those that were in opposition to God, those that did not want to see things rebuilt, when they wrote letters to the king, what kind of letter did they get back from the king? You're just going to say it. Not only did they get letters back to leave them alone, leave these people alone that we've sent back out of captivity, leave the people alone, but not only that, I want you to help them. You're going to help them by bringing supplies. You're going to help them by providing labor. And for sure, you're going to leave them alone. But each time the king changed, they sent another letter. So here we are with Artaxerxes, and they're just as stubborn, they're just as obstinate. So they came with an army. Well, why would the king do that? Why did they just say, you go ahead? If you want to go, you go ahead and go. Well, but they were basically friends. He was a court official. He was one of position of the king. So you can't have him mistreated. So again, he sent letters with him to the people of the land, the rulers. He sent letters to those of the forestry to cut down the trees and provide the supplies. help this man in the building. So anyway, what happens next? I want to see question number 2. How did they react to Nehemiah's arrival in Jerusalem? Page number 4, question number 2. How did they react when he came? It lists the names there of Sanballat and those of people of the land that were leaders of the people. But how did they react when he arrived? What did you put down on your page? Pardon? Displeased. What do you suppose they were displeased about? Yeah, somebody's coming to look them over. Somebody's coming that will bring change. I had very displeasing. They mocked. They were rebelling. That someone came to seek the welfare of those of the sons of Israel. I can't imagine that just the fact that I came to see how you were doing, that your next door neighbor would be upset. But that's kind of how this is. But not only that, who was living? You know, when they had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, well, when they all, the northern part went off into captivity years earlier before the southern kingdom, and those 10 tribes really kind of disappeared and intermarried and intermingled, and they were just kind of gone. But later, when Judah and Benjamin came back, well, that was the southern tribes, the southern kingdom, if you will. And who's living in the land? All of the other people. When they went off into captivity, it didn't take long, when they went off in the Assyrian captivity, that we need to do something with the land. And they sent people back, sent some of the 10 tribes back, and they intermarried and intermingled, and they were just there. And how long had they sort of been inhabiting all the land, both in the north and in the south? How long had they been inhabiting the land? And you're thinking, Brother Brent, that question is so simple. From the time that they went off into captivity, the others came and lived in the land and just sort of there they were. So now that Judah comes back and Benjamin comes back and they're receiving the blessing of the king and providing the things needing to rebuild, and the governors are being told to leave them be, the people are being told to assist them as needed. You provide the gold, the silver, the food, the animals that's needed, provide everything that's needed to rebuild. Well, why would they reject that? And Ray's thinking, because they would lose everything they have invested in the southern part of the kingdom. I don't know if somebody came to your house and said, really, you're going to have to move out. I know you think you have a legal title, but really, it was stolen from me, 50 years ago, and somebody else resold it and bought it, but here's really the title, it's mine. So you go, you have to go. How would you feel about that? Wouldn't you kind of resist that and fight that and take it to court? Well, they weren't taking it to court, but we're going to see later, what did they finally do in order to try to prevent them from doing the building? Took up arms. Again, made even further ridicule. It's just, even the fox could jump on it and break it down. They're going to use these old stones, and it just went on. But in this introductory, we find Jeremiah doing what in verse 12? What did Jeremiah do? In the night, he went out and checked it over. What is it? I said Jeremiah. It is Nehemiah. Yeah. So he made an inspection. Now, as you read in chapter 1, when he heard the reports about the city and the wall and how things were, he was grieved. It was his people. It was his place. It was Jerusalem. It was a place of God. So he goes and looks at it. And why did he look at it at night? It doesn't necessarily say, but why did he look at it at night? What is it? Because they were after him? Because the people were trying to restrict him? They were trying to work against him? Is that what you're saying? I'm not sure what you were saying. Who said something? I'm going to have to come back there. I know you got your mask on. I know you want to tell me. Why were they doing it at night?
To protect the wall from sabotage.
Hey, there you go. Protect from sabotage. Absolutely. He knew the people were not working with him, those of the land. And again, why didn't they want it built? Because they would be excluded. And what do we see in some chapters later on? When it was finally built, the wall was built, the gates were closed, everything was shut up. What came next? All the people left. They were forced to leave. And it talks about 1 in 10, and it talks about drawing lots of who could live in the city. And the others went and established their own place. But again, because of the people were working against him, they did it at night. So what did he find? When you look at question number 2, what destruction did Nehemiah, what observations did Nehemiah make about Jerusalem? Just in a few words, what did you put down there? Yeah. I put broken down and consumed by fire. Well, that's kind of what was reported. So how did his close friends react to his observation? The close friends of Nehemiah, how did they react? Let us arise and build. You know, again, I find a lot of things interesting as you look at the story. How long had they been there already? With Zerubbabel and Ezra, you know, that time together, 70, 80 years. Why hadn't they rebuilt it? Why hadn't they put it back in place? Why hadn't they put the people out that were not part of the family of God?
Wasn't Ezra more in the spiritual side of people trying to
Well,
spiritually more than...
okay, Ezra was more of he was in the priestly line, and he was trying to teach the law and so on, and that was his specialty of things. But day after day after day, there it was. And finally, when it was heard, when the right person at the right time, he's sent to do the rebuilding. And again, not only was it rebuilding the wall, that's what we think about, and how long did it take to rebuild the wall? You'll see that if you've read that far ahead. 52 days. Doesn't sound like much of a long-time job, but when you got multiple thousands of people working, and it talks about this person built this part, and another built this part, and this group built this part, and they have the whole wall around, and next week you have those things about who built what gate, and just page after page of who did what. You got the people working, and really you can accomplish a lot of stuff when you work, what's that next word? You work together. Isn't it the same today? If we can work together? Pardon? Yeah, the king provided all of that, the supplies that were needed. Told those people that you provide what's needed. Told the forester, you bring and cut the trees what's needed. I mean, everything's needed. All I have to do is put it together. And we're going to see a little later, let's look at verse 4 first, before we get out of time. It said, how did they react to Jeremiah's plans? Well, again, in verse 19 and 20, it says that they mocked, despised us, shut us out. Are you rebuilding against the king? Now, that's an interesting point we come back to. I mean, the people that were living in the land, and when Nehemiah started the building, what was their concern? Are you rebelling against the king? Well, was he rebelling against the king? They were probably surprised to find out that he was come under the direction of the king to do the rebuilding. And when you think about what the king was saying, who could stand against it? Nobody. But bottom line, who really is giving the direction? God is giving the direction. And we see that when Artaxerxes speaks about himself and sending that things may go well with himself and his sons. You know, we said it starting out that really the returning was under the direction of God. How long were they supposed to stay in captivity? 70 years. And when the 70 years were up, God spoke to the king, which would have been Cyrus at the time. Send them back. What did he say? Go back. Anybody want to go back? Go back. And they went back, some of them. Some didn't. Later, Ezra again. Some went, some didn't. Nehemiah, some went, some didn't. But it's all working out under the direction of God. And I don't know why it didn't just that quick. But again, as we started out, timekeeping is different with God. You know, it's not the days of the week and it's not the days of the hours. He has a plan. And things are carried out in his time schedule. It is interesting, and we'll see as we develop the lesson, that you know they never had another king. They had governors. They never had any great idol worship as they had in the past. They were never in captivity again, but they lived in subjection to the ruling authority. They lived in subjection to the king, and he provided. Of course, that's a good thing. When the Romans came along all those years later, they were still living in subjection to the king. And when Christ was asked, what did he say about should you pay the tax? What did he say? Get the coin. Who's on there? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God. And anywhere in the world, we can follow and be an honest, can I say, law-abiding citizen and still worship God. Now, are there sometimes hardships in being faithful to God? Do sometimes they chase you and want to put you in jail? Do sometimes they put you in prison? Sometimes they execute you? Well, join the group. That's what you find in the first century. Who do we read about a lot? Paul, and in the end, he was put to death. Statistically, as we can find historical writings, only John lived a long natural death. The rest died under persecution. One last thing, and just interesting to me, you know, they were supposed to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And if you go to Germany, you can go to the Museum of Natural History in Trier, and in that museum, well, let me back up. One of the denominational churches has a shoe, golden box, and in that box is the shoe of Andrew the Apostle. They claim it to be the shoe of Andrew the Apostle. If it is or not, I don't know. But they claim it's the shoe of Andrew the Apostle. But when you go to the museum, what you find historically are gravestones of Christians. It names who they were. One has said the elder so-and-so buried by his son, the deacon. And they have several hundred of those, what they call Christian gravestones from the 1st and 2nd, even into the 3rd century. So maybe Andrew was in Germany. Somebody had to be in that region teaching the gospel in order to have gravestones and elders and deacons of the church in the 1st and 2nd century. Interesting. Next week, as we come back, we'll look more directly at chapter 3, and it talks about who built what gate. We won't spend a lot of time with that because it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like that, unless there's something unusual. So be more prepared, I would say, to be talking more about chapter 4 and chapter 5, although we'll mention something about who did what gate and why it's so important that it's written of who did the building and who were the families that were involved. We'll talk about that next week. Thanks for your attention.